Hi, welcome to Abu Aardvark's Middle East Channel video blog. This week has been an exciting week in the Middle East with major developments in Syria, elections in Kuwait, and an escalating showdown in Egypt. Today we're going to have a special guest, Timothy Mitchell, who will be discussing his book and the development of Middle East studies. But first I wanted to say just a few things about these news stories. Syria. There seems to be a growing call, not necessarily for military intervention, but for the arming of the Free Syrian Army as a way of trying to deal with the escalating violence and crisis in Syria. I can understand the reasons why people want to do this. It's horrifying seeing the images coming out of Homs, coming out of Syria, and the escalating, absolutely brutal use of violence by the Syrian regime against Syrian protesters and against the Syrian opposition. And the temptation to do something is very, very strong, and I can understand that we're probably going in the direction of people wanting to provide aid, assistance, and increasingly weapons to the Free Syrian Army. Right now, though, that would be a mistake. Right now, there's still no unified leadership of the Free Syrian Army, and even with Western or regional military assistance, they would remain hopelessly outgunned. It's a recipe for disaster at the moment. And while I do believe that we are going to head in this direction, I'm really worried that what we're doing is setting ourselves up to simply arming the weaker side in a civil war. That's not a recipe for solving the problem. It's a recipe for protracted civil war and making things much, much worse than they already are. The time might come, but I don't think that time is yet here. We still need to explore political options. Number two, elections in Kuwait. I urge you to read an outstanding article that we just published by Gwen Okrahulik on the identity politics of those Kuwaiti elections. A lot of moderates and liberals are extremely worried about the victories by tribal candidates and by Islamists, and they have reason to be. On the other hand, there's also the opportunity for a real showdown between this parliament and the government, or within the parliament, over the assertion of rights of this elected body. It'll be interesting to watch. And stay tuned on that. Finally, there's the showdown between the Egyptian government and American NGOs. Frankly, it is absolutely outrageous that the Egyptian government, our ally, is threatening to imprison and put on trial American NGO workers. On Foreign Policy this week, we profiled a number of these people who've worked to bring democracy, civil society, and other forms of development to Egypt. And quite frankly, the Egyptian government should be thanking these people for what they've done to help bring about positive change instead of putting them on a show trial as a way of catering to nationalist and xenophobic sentiment. A lot of people are arguing that the time has come for us to sever our relations with the SCAF, to cut off military funding. It's hard to find any reason to argue that they're wrong. I think the Egyptian military needs to take a step back and think very seriously about what kind of relationship it's going to have with the United States in the future. We'll be following that story as we go ahead. But for now, I want to switch gears and talk to Timothy Mitchell, who is one of the most influential and intellectually creative members of the Middle East Studies establishment in the United States over the last 20 years, author of some of the most influential books about the Middle East, and author of a new book, Carbon Democracy. All right, it's a special treat this week to be able to have a conversation with one of the leading figures in Middle East studies over the last 2 decades, Timothy Mitchell, the chairman of the Department of Middle Eastern, South Asian, and African Studies at Columbia University, author of 2 of the most influential books on the Middle East, Colonizing Egypt and The Rule of Experts. He has a new book out, Carbon Democracy, Political Power in the Age of Oil, which he's speaking about tonight at George Washington University. And I took advantage of his being here in Washington, D.C. to sit him down and ask him some questions. Tim, since you do have a book out, and we're trying to publicize it so people will buy it, but why don't we start by just, if you could say a little bit about the book. What were you trying to do with the book, and what do you hope people get out of it?
Initially, I was trying to understand the relationship between oil and democracy. And there was a large literature on that already, around the notion of oil as a curse and something that acted very often as an impediment to democratic politics. And I was unhappy with a lot of that literature because it had very little to say about the oil itself. It talked about the curse as a problem of essentially too much money. Once the oil had been translated into revenue, that money corrupted in various ways or made other kinds of politics difficult.
That whole thing about no taxation, no representation.
Exactly, or else that it just forms of corruption or forms of arms spending and variations on that article, on that argument. So for me, the interesting thing was, what if we actually thought seriously about the oil itself, the way it's produced, the way it comes out of the ground, the way it's shipped? And is there something about the nature of oil as a source of energy and as the single most important source of energy that is also part of that problem or that question of oil and democracy? And as I started to do that, I thought, well, I'll think actually about it a little more broadly and think about the question of coal and democracy. And so the beginning of the book told a history of the rise of mass democracy in the West in relation to coal. And then that became even more interesting because you had what seemed an almost opposite relationship between the two.
Almost the entire discipline of economics, apparently, is driven by this bizarre relationship between energy and capitalism.
Well, it turned into, along the way, a history of economics as well, both sort of 19th century political economy.
We liked him because he thinks small.
I couldn't help it. I just followed these connections, one to the other. And it really became a book about, if you like, not oil versus democracy, but oil as democracy, or at least oil is something that's played this central role in the particular shape in the second half of the 20th century that democratic politics took. And then from that, looking in particular at this history of economics and the role of economies in democratic politics, both of the West and of places that depended on the production of oil.
I mean, one of the really provocative and interesting parts of the book is the argument that we always think about oil there being an energy crisis, but actually it's not a crisis at all, that this is actually the way it's supposed to work. And it's a very counterintuitive argument. Right. I mean, there's sort of two periods to the story of oil in terms of crisis, or maybe more. But one of the things I began to understand as I followed the history of oil and oil production in the Middle East through most of the 20th century is that the problem that the oil companies first and national oil producers later were facing was not a sort of crisis of too little oil, but constantly a threat of too much oil. Mm-hmm. And in fact, I kind of, in a couple of the early chapters, rewrote the history of oil exploration in the early 20th century. It's all about keeping the oil off the market.
It's about keeping it in the ground. It's about preventing rivals from developing it because of the way companies were continually threatened by the arrival of cheaper oil from elsewhere. And we knew about the history of cartels and so on the international level, but to see that operating on the ground. And then, of course, eventually we get to the story of the 73 oil crisis, and there's a chapter on that also retells that history.
Which wasn't a crisis at all.
Which wasn't a crisis at all. No, certainly not. But also has a slightly different history. I mean, it's amazing how often one still hears references to things called an OPEC price rise in reference to what happened in 1973. And for example, why that's a misleading account of what happened. It ought to be sort of common knowledge, but it's still talked about in those terms.
Still not. It's truly fascinating. Let's bring this up to date. So you hear talk now about all the questions about the Arab Spring and political change in the region, and now there's even the beginnings of a conversation about the U.S. Maybe redeploying, pulling troops, pulling bases out of the Gulf. But what do you make of this in terms of this argument?
Well, I was just finishing the book as the Arab Spring happened, so it doesn't directly address the developments of the last 12 months. But I think it does provide something of a ground for understanding them. First of all, I think you can actually draw a map of oil revenues and have a map of the Arab Spring. It's very simple. This is, I'm not sure this is in the book because it's more something I've been thinking about since. There are three kinds of oil countries in the region. There are those with none, Israel and a couple of its neighbors, Morocco. There are those with a lot, about 8 countries, mostly in the Gulf. And there's half a dozen in between. And the ones in between not only don't have much, but the oil they have has all been declining in the amount of revenue since the mid-2000s. those countries, those half dozen countries, are the countries of the Arab Spring. Now that I wouldn't push that too far, because that pushes me back into the old sort of mechanical oil produces or impedes democracy argument. But I think there is an element of oil revenues and general financial fiscal crisis that's been part of what's driven the Arab Spring. But what I get out of the book for thinking about the Arab Spring is not the specific question of oil and politics, though one can think in those terms, but that what I'm trying to do by thinking about oil is really think, among other things, about the question of political agency. How is it that at certain key times people are able to sort of build themselves into effective political forces that are able to engage in processes of democratization? And one of the things I wanted to do was sort of shift that from sort of thinking about the mind, of getting the right ideas in your head, and north thinking about capabilities on the ground, including the sort of capability to say no. The capability to say to those who occupy positions of power, to the oligarchs who are in power everywhere, no, you can't do that. You can't do that on behalf of me. You can't say you're representing me when you do that kind of thing. And how do you build what's often just needed as that ability to sort of intervene at that level? Even if it's just intervening with people you've elected through a democratic process to represent you, you've got to have some effective way to intervene in them. And that sort of ability to be recalcitrant, as I'd call it, is part of how I sort of change my thinking about political processes, just through thinking about oil.
That's very, very interesting. Let me ask one final question. About 20 years ago, maybe 30 years ago, you wrote a report for the Social Science Research Council about the area studies and the development of Middle East studies, and you placed it in the context of the Cold War and the needs of the national security state. And now we've got the Arab Spring, we've got scholars such as us trying to make sense of what's happening. Do you think things have changed? I mean, how would you evaluate the performance of the area studies in trying to make sense of what's happening?
Yeah, it's definitely changed. There'd be several things you could point to. I think one would be, in a way, that it's a much more diverse community of scholars, not only in political science, which was always the sort of stronghold of area studies expertise, but across a number of other disciplines, history, anthropology, and in a much wider number of sort of university locations, I would suspect, than what one would have found 20 years ago. The other, I think, is the much greater role of voices from the region here. I mean, your own work has been important for that, but also thinking about things like Jadaliyya, web-based and not, that are a mixture of scholars here and voices from over there, scholars here who are from there, and so on. That seems to me something very different from the kind of sort of forum for debate, and that's the kind of debate that would have happened at a similar moment 20 years ago. The one other thing I'd say is that I think this historical moment is different. So not only is the sort of the context of area studies different, but there was perhaps always a sense with previous moments of dramatic social change that the way forward was no. There was always a model of what somebody else had done. So if you think back to the East European revolutions, well, of course, they were embarked on a program of sort of free market neoliberal restructuring because that was understood to be the way forward. What's interesting at the moment, and I think it's an interesting moment for area studies, is that the way forward isn't clear. And
this is true.
You can't just say, well, here's the model, and here's how your economic system should be set up, or your political institutions organized. I think that's part of the larger moment we're at, but I think that's also reflected in area studies, and that area studies can't sort of constitute itself as just this body of people who sort of tell people in other parts of the world, here's how it's meant to work.
We can't tell them about themselves anymore. Yeah. All right, thank you very much. Timothy Mitchell, Chair of the Department of Columbia and author of Carbon Democracy. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you, Mark.